afternoon and welcome. My name is Anand Rao. I'm a faculty member here at UMW, and it's my pleasure to welcome you back to COVID-19 in Context, our IDIS 300 course that the University of Mary Washington is offering. And we're in for quite a treat tonight. You know, the COVID-19 pandemic has already profoundly impacted state and primary elections. And I think, like you, I'm worried about what's going to happen in November and have a lot of questions about how we can forecast what's going to happen in just a few short months. Now, fortunately, we have two excellent faculty members from our Department of Political Science joining us tonight. We have Dr. Rosalyn Cooperman, a professor of political science, and Dr. Stephen Farnsworth, professor of political science and director of UMW's Center for Media and Leadership Studies. The topic tonight is COVID and the 2020 U.S. presidential and congressional elections. So without any further ado, let me turn it over to Dr. Cooperman to start the presentation.
Hi, Anand. Thank you very much, and I appreciate it. I'd like to also thank Keith and Anand for facilitating this session and the others and anyone else who has had a hand in this really remarkable, I think, and timely effort that's really been an important educational resource for students in our Fredericksburg community. So we're delighted here in political science to be a part of that. And to be sure, I think what's really important is that COVID has made clear how the dimensions of this pandemic are interconnected within and across disciplines. And political science, the conversations that we're having today, will touch on things like something that our sociologist colleagues will talk about perhaps in a future session, and certainly some of the things that previous lectures have covered. Specifically today, Dr. Steve Farnsworth and I will be talking about one important thread in the relationship between COVID and politics, which is the impact of COVID-19, the pandemic, on congressional and presidential elections this fall. And to some degree, this is a dry run for what I'm going to be talking about with my FSEM this fall, because I am teaching a freshman seminar on campaigns and elections, and Dr. Farnsworth is teaching the parties and elections course in our department this fall. So I suspect this will be one of many conversations that we will be having. And I should say that while this is a domestic policy focus, our department has majors in both political science and international affairs, and our departmental colleagues will be talking about the impact of COVID on strategies, on both rather strategic and economic relationships with U.S. allies and adversaries across the globe, and certainly the relevance of coordinating resources and burden sharing and those types of things regarding COVID. But today we're going to do a domestic politics focus. I'll be talking about COVID and congressional elections, and Dr. Farnsworth will be talking about COVID and the upcoming presidential elections. And with that, there are really four main themes that I want to focus on, specifically that we'll look at the House side, where Democrats presently hold a majority in the United States House of Representatives. They do have more seats to defend. Republicans hold a majority in the U.S. Senate, and the way that the Senate works and how many seats are up for election this cycle, Republicans actually have more seats to defend. And then the final 2 points is that COVID as a pandemic has really suspended and upended traditional campaign strategies in some important ways. And this is I guess, helpful or relevant, certainly to incumbents, because for House and Senate members, they are generally better able to use the effects of incumbency to their advantage, particularly with their official duties and funds raised. So those are the things that I'm going to be talking about in the first half of the talk. So this first slide that you're looking at comes from Cook Political Report. This is a nonpartisan organization that tracks and looks at the competitiveness of races for both the House and the Senate, governor's races, and certainly the presidential race. And so what we see here is a bar, right? There are 435 members of the U.S. House of Representatives, and presently you can see that Democrats hold a majority. And what's important about this, and you'll see this little red line that goes through this, it's you can see it says 218, that is the 50+1 number, right? So the number that is needed for a party to gain a partisan majority. And so what we're looking at here is a continuum that runs from solid Democratic through solid Republican, right? So they've divided those 435 seats into different categories of solid Democratic races and solid Republican races, likely Democratic and Republican races. Those are competitive, but will likely stay with the party that presently holds the seat. Lean seats, which are going to be more competitive, and then of course those toss-up seats. And what's I think particularly interesting about this is that in essence, if you're looking at that solid Dem versus solid Republican, and you add up those numbers, guess what? That's 80%, right? It's 80% of the House. And so in other words, in 8 of 10 seats, if the incumbent is running for re-election, the partisan makeup of the district is such that if the incumbent is running or a member of their party, the incumbent will hold on to that seat. So the overwhelming majority of these seats are not going to be competitive. And this is something that I'll talk about in a little bit more detail in a future slide. What's important about that is that what's left is that remaining seats, those lean and those toss-up seats. And here you can see from the center, from the Cook Political Report, they identify there are more Democratic seats that are considered to be either likely Democratic, lean Democratic, and then those toss-up seats. So specifically that gray area where there are an N of 22 seats, what you have is basically 16 of those are presently held by Democratic members, and 6 of them are held by Republicans. And so what are in those 22 seats? Well, you've got congressional districts in Iowa, Pennsylvania, Texas, and scattered throughout the Northeast, but you also have here in the Commonwealth of Virginia, 2 of those seats, the 2nd congressional district that's currently represented by Elaine Luria, the 7th congressional district that's currently represented by Abigail Spanberger are also considered to be in those toss-ups. And so if we're thinking about, what's left, there's a very small percentage of races that are actually competitive that will be contested in the fall and in the primaries, and as some states have not held their primaries yet, something else that I will talk about. Again, what's important to recognize here, Democrats have a majority in the House. They have more seats to defend. There are more of them that are considered to be competitive. And what's particularly relevant about that is the impact of COVID on congressional districts. The map that you see here in the second slide comes from Pew Research Center. And what they did was take a look at, and you can see it on the main heading that it says, the 10% of congressional districts hardest hit by COVID deaths account for more than half of all US deaths. So in other words, at this particular snapshot in time, if we're looking at COVID fatalities, the map of the United States, which has been roughly parsed out into congressional districts, what you see are lighter colored districts have had the lowest percentage of COVID deaths, whereas the colors that are that deep orange or even dark brown are the congressional districts that have had the highest number of COVID deaths. Well, if we're thinking about this and what those look like, and you can see from this, you'll see areas of New York City and the boroughs of New York City, Boston, Detroit, New Orleans. And I think what's important to recognize is that these are more urban. Some of these districts are poorer. They are geographically dense, so it's harder to socially distance in your work and living conditions. And they're both and all of these districts rather that have had the highest number of COVID deaths are among those that are the most racially and ethnically diverse. And so what's particularly important in those safe Democratic districts, right, in the Boston area, Detroit, New York City, and New Orleans, and in some of the other ones, is that voters are looking at COVID not just through the lens of this public health crisis, but also from the economic crisis and also from system level racial injustice. And certainly we see the widespread protests in countries across the United States, commingling these issues. And so it's certainly something that is important, and it also is almost an add-on, but something that has been a pre-existing condition, to be sure. But what's interesting about this map, if we take a look at it and its importance for congressional districts, is that this snapshot in time has changed and will likely change as the virus has spread. And so, for example, today the Washington Post has reported a spike in cases in COVID, both cases and hospitalizations. Obviously, that's different than COVID deaths, but that 10 states had reported a sharp increase in new COVID cases and hospitalizations. And those are coming in districts, in congressional districts that are generally Republican. And so there was a study that was recently done by William Fry at the Brookings Institute looking at confirmed what are called high prevalence counties, where you've had this sharp increase in the number of COVID cases. And that in March, you had 59 counties and about 8% of the population. By May, you had 1,859, so nearly 2,000 counties looking at high prevalence COVID infections. That's 86% of the population. And so in other words, this notion of COVID and COVID issues are only going to be a focus of democratically held congressional districts is not going to continue as we see in these infection rates increase. So COVID certainly will impact all House and Senate races, but it will have no impact on the number or the re-election fortunes of more than about two-thirds rather, of the Senate, whose Senate seats are not up for re-election, right? So the Constitution tells us something really awesome in that every 2 years, all 435 House members, they have two options. You either you run for re-election, or you retire, right? Well, that's not the case in the Senate. And so in the Senate, presently in this cycle, the 2000 election cycle, or 2020 election cycle, forgive me, that 35 out of 100 seats are up for re-election or up for election. And so in other words, you have the majority of the Senate will remain as it is in terms of its partisan composition. And unlike in the House, where you have more Democratic seats to defend, the Senate, you have actually more Republican seats to defend. And so this map that's coming from 270 to Win, a nonpartisan organization that also tracks elections and the competitiveness of races, you can see again the states that appear in this map of the United States that appear in gray. They don't even have Senate seats that are up for election in this cycle. If you take a look, for example, at Virginia, and it's colored blue in this instance, we have one Senate seat that's up, right? The seat that's presently held by Senator Warner is up for re-election. He is up rather for re-election. And the other Senate seat held by Democrat Tim Kaine, that election would not occur until 2024 because he was elected in 2018. So what's left? Well, the states that are shaded rather, you can see in various colors, will either be a mix of either those safe Republican or Democratic seats, and then as the shades of blue and red respectively get a little lighter, you see that that's the equivalent of the lean or the likely seats that are held. Those four states in brown, Arizona, Colorado, North Carolina, and Maine, those are considered toss-up seats. And all four of those are held by Republican senators, right? And so if we're thinking about this in terms of the impact, all congressional districts, all House districts are going to be impacted. Only a third, essentially, of Senate's seats are going to be impacted with the upcoming elections. And this leads me to the last 2 points that I would like to make in thinking about the importance of COVID and thinking about its impact on congressional elections, is that the pandemic really has suspended traditional campaign strategies in ways that we really haven't seen. And that, again, incumbency for House and Senate members is generally an advantage. So I want to take those points in turn. For one, it's June, right? And so this means that it is the summer season, which is heavy for campaigns. And we're talking about things things like parades, fairs, block parties, summer sports events, you know, any and all of those types of things. And this is where candidates for office will come and they want to meet with voters and they want to talk to voters and they want to see what's on their minds, right? Well, all of those face-to-face events have largely been suspended. And so while a lot of fundraising, for example, for both challengers and incumbents has moved online, it's hard, you know, if we're thinking about this in terms of fundraising, for example, you know, the COVID is also an economic crisis. And so asking individuals for money is a trickier thing to do. So this notion of the face-to-face interactions with voters that are the mainstay of campaigns really has been suspended right now. The second issue, and why this is perhaps greater to the advantage of incumbents, is that several states haven't even held their primaries. Here in the Commonwealth of Virginia, for example, our primary was moved from the 9th of June yesterday. It was supposed to take place yesterday to the 23rd of June. Arizona doesn't have its primary until August 3rd. Well, why does this matter? If we go back to those toss-up races in Virginia 2 and Virginia 7, presently in Virginia 2, there are three Republicans that are trying to contest the nomination to run against the incumbent Elaine Luria. In Virginia 7, there are 8 Republicans on the primary ballot, right? And so there's no identified candidate who will be the exact opponent for incumbents in states that haven't had primaries. And also incumbents are frankly better positioned to use their official resources to remind voters what they have done. And here, if you look at the screen, you can see I've pulled up pages for Elaine Luria and Republican Susan Collins, senator from Maine. And their pages, their official congressional pages are very specific about the resources that they can provide and make available to constituents, whether or not you voted for them, to assist in this COVID pandemic. This is something that challengers don't have the opportunity to do. In addition, if we're thinking about what Congress has done, and by March of this year, rather, Congress had passed 3 specific pieces of legislation designed to help individuals related to COVID. And a lot of this came in, for example, extending student loan forgiveness, increasing unemployment insurance benefits and the like, right? And so again, these are things that incumbents can do. So again, if we're thinking about this in terms of those, how COVID would impact congressional elections in 2020, we can come back to the notion that, again, we've got a House that is democratically held that will likely remain in that regard. The Senate is Republican held, but there are more Republican seats to defend. And while incumbency may be an advantage to them, there are 2 last things to pay attention to. COVID is one of 3 things in the mix on the mind's eye of voters right now, right? And if we look at polling going into the spring, so even before the COVID pandemic, we saw that healthcare and the economy topped voters' concerns. So even before COVID, issues related to healthcare and issues related to the economy were at the top of what's on voters' minds going into the election. The second is what's called the generic congressional ballot. And this is a question that pollsters have asked for several decades now. And it basically asks, you know, if the if congressional elections were held today, which party would you vote for in your district? They don't talk about who the candidates are or anything like that. And presently, Democrats have about, in looking at these generic congressional ballots from different public polling sites, generally have about a 10% advantage going to Democrats. So what does all this mean? Well, in the House and the Senate, certainly the House will likely remain Democratic. The Senate may be Democratic, right? Depending on how those toss-up or lean seats go. The question, of course, is whether or not the current Democratic advantage will extend to the presidential race. And at this point, I'm going to hand the baton over to my colleague, Dr. Farnsworth, for the second half of our presentation.
Thank you very much, Dr. Cooperman, and I'm here to talk primarily about the presidential election. And the key thing that is important for us to appreciate as we look at the part of the conversation that I have responsibility for today is that I'm going to talk a good deal about public opinion. And there are two things to remember about public opinion. The first of all, it is an approximation of where people are in the country. We ask 1,000 people to give us a sense of where 300 million people are, and we have some general sense of how that is going to be. An example of this would be if you were to have 1,000 pennies and you threw them all up in the air and they all came down on the table, and you would expect maybe 500 or so to be heads and 500 to be tails. And you can repeat this as many times as you want, and in all likelihood, you're going to get somewhere close to 500, 500 if these are coins that are not Vegas coins that are designed to give you one outcome or another. And so what we have here is an approximation for the process of where the public is. And given that, it's also important to remember that it's not exact, because if you were to throw those 1,000 coins up and you had 505 or 510 heads, you'd still say that's not a big deal. You'd expect something along those lines. The second thing to remember about surveys is that they're not far off if done properly. When you think about a 1,000-person survey and a candidate has 40% approval, maybe that is 42, 43, maybe it's 38, 37, but it's roughly where the candidates are if you give them a few points plus or minus from where they are. And if you think about the 2016 election, where a lot of pollsters came into some question, there were two things to remember about that. First, you had the outcome that was correctly identified in terms of the popular vote winner. But with respect to the individual states, one of the mistakes that they made in places like Michigan and Pennsylvania was to stop polling in that last week of the campaign. And when you look at a snapshot of where people were in mid-October or even late October, that didn't necessarily take effect. The consequences of the decision to reopen that FBI investigation and then to determine that there was nothing further to measure. So basically, with those general points about public opinion, I want to talk about some of these data points that we're going to be discussing today. The thing to remember about 2020, which is different from 2016, is that this is an election with an incumbent president. And so as a result, you're looking at a question of how the president has done that is less significant in a year like 2016, when Barack Obama could not run again. We know from our history of looking at these questions that economic conditions are usually the main focus of voters. We also, and this of course is one of the key advantages that President Trump had before COVID-19. The economy had been working well during the first 3 years of the Trump presidency, and those economic numbers, even now, people in the country think that Biden is no better, and maybe Trump is a little bit better at managing the economy. So economy, I think, is the key question in terms of the outcome in November with respect to the speed of the economic recovery and whether there's a second wave or not in COVID. These are the kinds of factors that will give people a positive or negative evaluation of Trump in October. It's important to remember that a day is like a month in politics because things can change so rapidly. But one of the things that hasn't changed all that rapidly is the way in which many people in the public view the president. Most people do view politics through a partisan lens. And that is one of the reasons why the COVID-19 situation has not had more powerful an impact on presidential approval ratings. Basically, the people who identify as Democrats do not like the president. The people who identify as Republicans do. And that has changed very little historically over the 3 years plus of the Trump presidency. Trump, the president, and the presidential candidate has been pretty consistently in the 40% range of approval. How do you win an election with 40%? Well, you can win it by being less negative choice in the minds of the voters than the alternative. When you think about the evaluation of presidential approval ratings right now, even though the numbers for President Trump are below 50%, right now his current approval rating is at 39%, according to Gallup. 85% of the Republicans approve of the job he's doing, 39% of the independents do, and 5% of the Democrats. So you can see just how powerful these partisan lenses are. And that's one of the reasons why in this political environment, there is not a great deal of movement over these times. But what's also true is an issue of control of the conversation is being chosen, media sites are being chosen by the candidates and by the voters who support those candidates. You really do see, when you're looking at COVID-19, for example, the information that Republican and Democratic voters, where they go for their news and how they evaluate information and misinformation, once again, divides very cleanly on these partisan lines. It's one of the reasons why I think presidents really struggle, not just this president, but historically, presidents really struggle in terms of bringing people together, because so much of how people view the news is through the lens of Fox News or MSNBC or NPR or the Washington Post, wherever they might get their news. And that has an impact on the way in which they evaluate politics. Because after all, if you're a Republican voter, you're probably going to find messages that are more compatible on Fox News. And if you're a Democratic voter, you're probably going to look somewhere else. Now, if you look at where President Trump is today, it's clear that this is not a good position from which to run for re-election. If you look at where other presidential candidates were shortly before the election, that is June polling numbers in their year 4, Trump's numbers are comparable to the candidates who did not get a second term. George H.W. Bush was at 37% approval at this point in his presidency. He lost to Bill Clinton in '92. Jimmy Carter was at 32% approval at this point in his presidency. He lost, of course, to Ronald Reagan. And Gerald Ford was at 45% approval, and he lost to Jimmy Carter in '76. The numbers of winning candidates' approval ratings can be much higher. If you think about Ronald Reagan, for example, he was at 54% approval. Bill Clinton, 55% approval. George H.W. Bush, 49%, and Barack Obama, 46%. So the number right now for the president, 39%, is sort of in the middle, close to where the candidates who have not been reelected were, but somewhat below the candidates who did get a second term. As Dr. Cooperman mentioned, there is a significant impact of the economic issues and other issues. And so when we asked people in the country what it was that they were most concerned about as they were thinking about voting for the presidential election, the economy comes first, healthcare is second, and COVID-19 is third. Foreign policy, national security, climate change, immigration, taxes, these are all much further back. This survey was conducted, of course, before the George Floyd incident, and all indications are that there's going to be a significant impact of that story in terms of how voters will be approaching this election going forward. So far, an early indication about how important this is going to be, a survey conducted by the Washington Post in the last few days suggests that more than 2/3 of Americans think that the death of George Floyd was a broader problem of law enforcement and not an isolated incident, which suggests there may be a significant issue to add to this list going forward. But with respect to COVID-19, President Trump is at something of a disadvantage in the minds of voters when they're asked who is trusted more in terms of handling the coronavirus. Biden had 55% and Trump 41%. This is from a CNN poll that's out earlier this week. And as I mentioned, the economy is one of the strong advantages that Trump has had historically. He's seen as having a stronger ability to manage the economy than Joe Biden is right now. But what is clear is that one of the key factors relating to whether or not Trump is reelected will in fact be the things that we just don't know the answer to right now. Will there be a second outbreak? of COVID-19 infections? Will there be an increase in the economic activity in the country, or will we have to enter another lockdown or something along those lines? When you think about news content, once again, you see people looking at these things through very, very powerful partisan lenses. When you think about who is the main source of misleading or false information, the Democrats will say it's the Trump administration, and the Republicans will say it is mainstream news outlets. Beyond that, though, the parties, Democrats, Independents, and Republicans, all have pretty similar views with respect to the other impact, the state elected officials, friends and family, and so on. They're not seen as major sources of news misinformation. There's another survey out there, and this is one of the ways in which we are so divided as a country. It suggests that a willingness to wear a mask, Democrats are more willing to wear masks than Republicans are. So in addition to the idea that there is some sort of geographic distribution that may be affecting some of the ways in which candidates are facing the COVID issues in their own communities, there is also the fact that people are now increasingly, even the question of how to handle social distancing and wearing a mask has become an ideological disagreement. Now, I want to talk a little bit about the Electoral College before we turn it to our general discussion. And what we have here is a map, not unlike the one that you saw from Dr. Cooperman a moment ago, that looked at the Senate races. This looks at the Electoral College math here. Because, of course, approval numbers in the country as a whole are not relevant to the 270 electoral votes that you need to win. And the same dynamic that you saw in that map is here, where the darker the red, the darker the blue, the greater the advantage for the party, Democrats and Republicans. The gray shading is those areas where there is uncertainty, the greatest uncertainty about how this dynamic will play out. Now, a few things with respect to COVID-19. One of the things that we're noticing is that over the last several days, we're seeing increases in the 7-day average of cases. Now, some of that may be an effect of better testing, but these higher numbers are showing up in places that include swing states and potential swing states, including Arizona, North Carolina, Florida. Now, I don't necessarily think that we can call Texas a swing state, but the polls do show a closer race there than normally is the case for Republicans. And Texas is also one of the states that is marked with a higher rate of increase. We're also seeing greater increases in counties away from the big cities. And so as this COVID-19 spreads to some of those areas that haven't been so hard hit in the early going, we are seeing a significant challenge in some of the places where I think some of the voters and certainly some of the governors and politicians had hoped they might have been spared the worst of it. Now, in this chart, I want to give you scenarios for how these scenarios might play out. And so think about this in the context of how one gets to 270. And I've set this chart up in the context of how President Trump gets to 270. And so if we start with the 204 electoral votes that 270 to win places in the favor and lean to Republican category, you can see that there are 66 more electoral votes that would be needed for President Trump to get a second term. And so I've basically created 4 groups of these swing states. And on the left, you see Arizona. This is a state Republicans have won in the last 4 election cycles, but looks very competitive this time. If Trump wins the state that the Republicans have won 4 times in a row, then his number will bump up to 215. If he wins the places where Republicans have won 3 out of 4, and that would be every election except the Barack Obama 2008 election, that would include North Carolina and the 2nd district of Nebraska. Maine and Nebraska each have electoral votes that will be divided by the candidate who wins the congressional district. So in the case of Nebraska, which has 5 electoral votes, the Republicans are very comfortably going to win 4 of those electoral votes. But the 2nd district, which includes the biggest city in Nebraska, Omaha, that's a district that Trump won, that that Barack Obama won in 2008, but the Republicans have won it in every other election. That is a potential place where the Democrats could, and on a good night, do well. But if Trump wins where the Republicans have won 3 of the last 4, that brings him up to 231. If you then think about the biggest swing state prize, Florida, if Trump wins where the Republicans have won 2 out of 4, Trump gets 260. And then he would need one more big Republican win, perhaps in Michigan, perhaps in Pennsylvania, perhaps in Wisconsin. Now, all 3 of those states were states that Trump won in 2016, but that they had lost, the Republicans had lost in the 3 previous election cycles. And Trump also won all of those very narrowly. Less than 1% was the margin in 2016. Now, one sort of nightmare scenario, of course, would be a 269 tie. That moves the election to the House of Representatives. That tie would occur if Trump wins everything in the 4 Republican wins, 3 Republican wins, 2 Republican wins, and the Wisconsin electoral votes in the 1 Republican win, but loses Nebraska too. And in that case, then it goes to the House of Representatives. And then each state will be able to, as a state delegation, determine which candidate they would prefer to be in the White House. If there were an Electoral College tie, the likelihood there is that the Republican candidate, Donald Trump, would win a majority of those state delegations because most state delegations are under Republican control right now. A scenario that would envision presidential elections being that close would probably also mean that there wouldn't be a huge upswing in the number of Democratic seats in the House, which would decide that outcome. So as we look at this process, you're really looking at a very compelling election season in which to consider politics and to deal with the many questions and challenges of 2020. And so with that, I will hand it back to Dr. Rao and Dr. Mellinger to handle the question and answer part of our time together today.
All right, thank you very much, Dr. Farnsworth, Dr. Cooperman. That was terrific. Fascinating, interesting. I'm ready to run to the polls. We have a lot of questions that have come in, and I can't wait to get started here. I'm really interested in your perspective on some of these things. I'm Keith Mellinger. I'm the Dean for the College of Arts and Sciences. I haven't had a chance to introduce myself yet. And let's jump right into the Q&A. The top question that we've received, and it's gotten more votes by far than anything else, and I think this is a good one for you, Dr. Farnsworth. I've heard that Donald Trump might try to postpone the election. Can he do that? Sorry, unmute yourself.
The simple answer is no. The way that this process works is that the election date is set by Congress, and it can only be changed by Congress. And if there is one thing the Democrats who are in the majority in the House will not do is delay the election. It's also something that hasn't happened in American politics either. It's important to remember that when we think about delaying a primary for a couple of weeks, as we did in Virginia, that doesn't really change the outcome. The people who were elected to serve 2-year terms or 4-year terms or 6-year terms, there's still a general election in which they are going to be deciding that outcome. And so even during the Civil War, a time when this country was torn in half, the election of 1864 took place on time. And so it doesn't seem likely that Donald Trump would be able to delay the election even if he wanted to. It is one of those things where there are certain areas in which there is more latitude for a politician. If you think about the states and the choices that they make with how to structure an election, who gets to vote, how you register, those kinds of things can be very, very powerful in directing outcomes. But changing the date of the election, no, not going to happen.
Excellent. Thank you both for a really stimulating discussion. A lot of good questions. And I have the next one to ask. And I think this is probably one that I want to first turn to Dr. Cooperman to ask. It's a question about districts and how those districts might play out in terms of the impact of COVID. And it's asking about whether or not the worst hit districts, being Democratic districts, is that due to Democratic policies or because of the nature of those districts, perhaps being denser populations?
It's the latter, right? And so if you think about the average congressional district has about 627,000, give or take a few tens of thousands or several tens of thousands, depending on if you're, for example, the state of Montana, which has a population of over 1 million and still has just one congressional district. It varies tremendously. But if you're thinking about, areas, so take, for example, the Commonwealth of Virginia. Northern Virginia has several congressional districts within a finite geographic space, right? And that has to do with the distribution of population across that geographic space. And so if we're thinking about, the slide that I had showed about the top 10% of congressional districts hardest hit by COVID-19 deaths account for more than half of all US deaths, is that the common denominator with those is that those were very densely populated districts, right? Now they are represented by Democrats, but these are districts that are going to be in urban areas. They're, again, geographically very densely populated. And so those are areas, for example, that have a harder time in the everyday universe of being able to live, socially distant from one another, to be able to work socially distant from one another. These districts, if you look at the distribution of population, you also see more ethnic and racial diversity in more urban districts. And we also know that COVID-19 has had a disparate impact on communities of color. There's a lot that can be said, and I suspect our sociology friends in a later topic will talk about something called the social determinants of health. And so this has less to do with the partisan politics, but in terms of how people live, and in essence, in this case, just who happens to be the representative. But there's a disconnect between those, to be sure.
Thanks for that. Excellent. Let's go back to Professor Farnsworth. A question about the pandemic. If the pandemic is still around in November, which political party benefits if we're still in the midst of a pandemic come election time? And in addition, which political party has the most to gain by blocking cheap or inexpensive treatment options?
Well, it's very hard to predict what's going to happen with respect to the science. Will there be a vaccine or not? And so the question is going to come down to, will there be that second outbreak? And will that affect the outcome of these elections? And the answer to that is really going to be a state-by-state calculation. If you're thinking about the mechanics of how elections are conducted, each individual state has its own laws for how easy or how difficult it is to get a mail-in ballot, whether those will be provided automatically to the people with registered voter identification, whether there will be enough voting infrastructure, whether those people who are going to vote on election day, will they have to wait in line as people did yesterday for 6 or 7 hours in some cases. And so, everything is going to depend on individual choices made in individual states. And one of the things that I think is essential for us to consider as we think about this election is the question of election mechanics. Can we really count on a system that is credible and legitimate if people are afraid to show up? And so I think that at a minimum, it would be very wise for states around the country to develop a system to be prepared for the possibility that this is going to be more or less a mail-in election for everybody because people don't feel safe. It isn't just the voters too, mind you. If you've ever voted, and some of you have voted at least an election or two, you know that the people who are there all day are not necessarily in the full bloom of youth, let's just say. And so the reality there is that they're going to be a little bit uncomfortable maybe handing things back and forth to hundreds or thousands of people going through the line. So we have to be prepared for that. And I think that one of the failures so far in terms of the way that Congress has dealt with the question of COVID-19 response has been a failure to allocate money for this kind of emergency pandemic voting system that I think may be what we're going to end up with in November.
With so many complexities to consider in the mechanics of the election, and then also I think the next question speaks to the complexities in the minds of the voters, how to parse out what are really generationally big issues to work with. And so the next one I open for either of you because they frame it as being a presidential or congressional election that it might impact, but thinking about it from the perspective of a voter, which issue will probably take the spotlight or maintain the spotlight? Will it be issues related to COVID-19? Will it be issues related to the current set of protests and social justice concerns and issues? And how do they get parsed out? Is it your experience that there tends to be one issue that will really keep the spotlight and be the focus for most voters? Or will it be something that you could really factor in both?
I would say this in terms of, and I think this is where when voters go to vote, they have salient issues, right? And so the salient issues that motivate their vote for a representative or a senator may not be the same, or rather often are the same as the ones, in terms of what would animate their vote for the presidential race. And so I think what's important to recognize, again, if you recall, issues of the economy are perennial salience to voters, right? These are generally, people will assess how and whether they're going to vote, who they're going to vote for in terms of economic concerns or their own economic condition. But what you also have is an enduring thread of issues related to healthcare. And it's a generic enough question. Well, what is your concern of healthcare? Is it healthcare access? Is it healthcare affordability? And those types of things. And we know that what COVID-19 has done is those issues are interwoven, right? And so the type of issues that are always and often on the minds of voters, like the economy, have a thread of a pandemic woven into them now, right? For many individuals who are also looking at the relationship between COVID and the economic crisis and systemic issues of racial injustice, those three things really are interwoven. You can't unpack one without talking about the others. And so I think what's important about this is that, this notion of, well, COVID is concentrated in certain hot spots that may be in urban locations and whatnot. What we're seeing is that that's just not the case anymore. If you look at those high prevalence COVID districts, these are in lots of communities that are more rural in their makeup, that are in states that have Republican delegations, Republican governors, senators, and the like. And so issues related to COVID, the safety of the space, any and all of those types of things, you have candidates who are going to be asked about, what they have to say about that and what their party is prepared to do.
I would agree with everything Dr. Cooperman has said, and I would add a couple of additional points to this. When you think about workplaces, you also are thinking about hotspots. One of the things that you have seen, particularly in meat packing plants and pork packing plants in the Midwest, in places like Iowa and Minnesota, are hotspots because people are living together in very close quarters, they're working together in very close quarters. And so even though the numbers for Iowa as a whole or Minnesota for a whole are nowhere near the numbers you'd see on the East Coast in terms of per capita infections, the reality is that these are places that have very significant local impacts that are overwhelming, in some cases, the healthcare delivery network in those places. So it's important to remember that that COVID is not going to be just an East Coast phenomenon and not just a Democratic congressional district phenomenon. The other thing that's important to recognize as we think about sort of going forward and what people are caring about as they vote, in the case of the presidency, I would argue there is one very different thing that is always a key issue. And that is the question of character, the question of judgment of the individual. An individual member of the Senate or of the House is one of a whole bunch of people. And you may or may not like them personally, but if they can get the job done, you can feel perhaps that you will overlook shortages or limitations, challenges of character, whatever term you might like. But with a president, it's very different because a president's a unilateral actor in so many things. The president decides how to handle a demonstration outside the White House. That's his call. A president decides whether to have a good relationship or a poor relationship with North Korea or China or Russia or with the opposing party. And all of the other politicians, more or less, in the president's party have to follow along. And so those kinds of components are really, really important. And I think that this is one of the ways that means one of the reasons why the presidential contest is so fixed, because if you do not have an opinion about Donald Trump, be it positive or negative at this point about who he is and how he's going to handle things, you really haven't been paying all that much attention. Donald Trump has dominated the news cycle since the day he was first a candidate, and questions of character and judgment have been the core in the way that he's presented himself. I alone can fix it, he said, but it's also the central way in which the people who are opposing Trump, be it the impeachment managers or now Joe Biden, have focused the conversation as well, that President Trump, suffers from limitations of character that are not presidential. So no doubt about it, the COVID issue is going to be key to the way in which the economy moves forward or not. But there are also other factors to consider, like presidential character, when we're talking about the Electoral College in a national contest.
It is difficult to imagine a voter not having some opinions about certainly many of those issues that I've outlined, Dr. Farnsworth. I want to ask a bit of a follow-up to Dr. Cooperman, because there's another question in the Q&A related to the discussion of healthcare, and that is whether or not you think, given the pandemic and concerns, as Dr. Farnsworth further elaborated on, healthcare concerns for those impacted in concentrated workspaces, if you think that the call for nationalized, socialized medicine, Medicare for all, will be more of an issue or more of a motivating factor for voters this year than in previous years.
That's a great question. I think a particularly relevant one. Again, if we're thinking about the types of things, the types of issues, the salient issues that motivate voters, healthcare is knocking at the door of the economy, right? And so, again, it's important to recognize what exactly is the dimension of healthcare that is the concern of prospective voters, and what are the policy choices that they support or oppose. And I think, again, if we're thinking about candidates in both at the presidential level, but also in terms of Senate and House. ACA, the Affordable Care Act, Obamacare, as some are want to call it, which was passed in 2010, enacted in 2013, remains in essence the system that is in place. And a key component of that was whether or not states had the opportunity to expand Medicaid, right? So access to health care for individuals, for the poor and disabled, although a fair amount of that expenditure actually goes to pay for seniors and their health care as well. What's relevant about that, though, is that if we're thinking about Obamacare, right? So it was passed by a Democratic Congress and a Democratic president, and the Republican policy alternative to Obamacare has been repeal Obamacare, right? Repeal and replace Obamacare, but we don't exactly know what that replace looks like. And so if we're thinking about this conversation about what to move forward, do we move forward with like a Medicare for all type system that has been championed by, if you're looking at the Democratic presidential contenders, those types of things, that is certainly in the mix, right? But if we're thinking about, again, the optics and how parties are viewed as having an advantage or a disadvantage of party ownership on issues, issues related to health care generally go to the Democrats and the Democratic Party. And I think particularly if we're thinking about, again, as much as presidents want to pass things that pass legislation, that's Congress's job. And so there's no type of legislation or change to legislation. Presidents can make executive orders, but they can't pass legislation. They have to rely on Congress for that. And the 117th Congress, which will convene in January of 2021, will almost certainly have a Democratic majority in the House and may well have a Democratic majority in the Senate. And then it becomes what exactly is palatable in terms of movement on healthcare and other issues for that Congress. And of course, thinking about who would be the president and the ability to veto or sign legislation into law.
Thanks a lot for that. Turning back to Dr. Farnsworth, there's been a lot of discussion, I think, in the last week about mail-in ballots, and I'd like to hear a little bit about that. one question is, do we expect more of that in order to prevent spread of the virus? Do you expect a lot more mail-in ballots? But also, how does the mail-in ballot option affect security or accuracy of the election?
Yeah, with respect to mail-in ballots, I think it's clear when you look at poll numbers that a lot of Americans want to have that option available for them as they consider whether or not they want to stand in line. And if you're thinking about social distancing and you're thinking about wearing a mask and you're looking at the capacity of states to find enough people willing to be working all day at an election institution, you really do see a real challenge here. And so there's clearly a great preference for mail-in ballots. You'll see that a lot of people use them. When we look at the numbers in Virginia, for example, there was a huge increase in mail-in ballots during the municipal elections. A number of cities and counties in Virginia had a municipal election in May. And that was an overwhelmingly mail-in ballot system. And that's one of the things to remember, that you can do these things well or you can do them poorly, and planning is one of the key mechanisms to make sure that the election authority is prepared to handle this. We get a lot of stuff that comes in the mail. We use the mail for the rebate checks, for example, that the president and Congress approved for the folks who are going to get the $1,200 or up to that amount. And so this is something that we use for all kinds of things. And so when we have a mechanism of mail-in ballots, we have a history that shows that the system actually works pretty well. The one potential problem for mail-in ballots, and this is one of the things that we need to fix, is the question of the timing. We have had a challenge in a number of places. You noticed it in Georgia yesterday, where people asked for mail-in ballots weeks ahead of time, did not get them in time to mail them back in. And that is on Georgia to do better. One of the things that I can say about Virginia, as many of us are Virginia voters, it is important to recognize that Virginia has made it easier to vote by mail. New rules coming into place July 1 will make it easier still to register and participate. And once again, many of the states in America would be wise to follow the lead of the Commonwealth when it comes to these kinds of things. We are doing much better than many other states in terms of adapting our electoral system to this pandemic. And other states should be learning from us, because it seems like the voters really want this, but it does seem that some states are just not keeping up with voter constituent demands, even of their own states' preferences.
And just to add on briefly to that, I think what's also important, if you're looking at congressional districts here in the Commonwealth, for example, the notion that the Commonwealth has made it easier to request mail-in ballots for the upcoming primary. This is a fact that is advertised on every candidate's webpage, campaign webpage, right? For Democrats, for Republicans, right? And so it's a curious thing that if the U.S. mail is good enough to send stimulus checks from the CARES Act that was passed with bipartisan support from Congress, that $1,200 to Americans making $75,000 or less, right? Those rebate cards are coming in the mail. If we know that candidates on both parties are saying, yes, you can request a ballot to vote absentee, then in essence, there is bipartisan support and an expectation that the U.S. mail is a perfectly legitimate way to conduct this kind of business.
That's excellent. Thank you for that. And I think we have time probably just for one last question. Given that, the top question that is listed is talking about the impact of coronavirus or protests on the election. We had a chance to already address that in some of the earlier questions. I want to move to the next one and talk a bit about redistricting and gerrymandering, the impact of COVID. Of course, there's a concern about great loss of life from a pandemic and how that might impact redistricting, but also what else could you forecast in terms of perhaps population shifts as we're looking at people moving away from cities in some instances? How do you think that might factor in, given that this is a census year, how that might factor in later on as we're looking at other redistricting or gerrymandering concerns?
I would, I'll answer very briefly and then pivot to let Dr. Farnsworth finish up answering this question. But I think what's important to recognize, the census has traditionally been a very vital source of information for all kinds of things, right? Measuring, the disbursement of COVID cases, for example, is something that I mentioned, and a demographer used to look at those high prevalence counties. That's all census data, right? And so I think the value of the census is one that is going to be central, not just in terms of gerrymandering or redistricting, right? The way that congressional districts are drawn, and that states have different ways to go about doing that. But previously we've been in this most recent cycle of there have been legal challenges rather to the issue of whether or not a citizenship question should be asked on the census, right? And so already, even before the COVID pandemic, there were concerns about what the census 2021 would look like, right? Or the census 2020 for congressional districts moving forward and how it would be used. And these are things that are not going to go away with this electoral context and the various issues that we've been dealing with. But it is perhaps not as immediate a concern for voters who are very much focused on issues of the economy and healthcare.
The one thing that I would mention is that this coronavirus occurred at the worst possible time from the point of view of a reliable census. We asked people where they are on April 1. You may recall that we, as a country, more or less went into lockdown in mid-March. Normally what occurs is that individual enumerators will go out and look at households that haven't reported, that haven't put that information back. For this year, of course, better than any other previous census, there was a capacity to do this online. But that is going to be only a certain segment of the population that would, one, have the technology in the house, and two, have the willingness to undertake a census online. And that's why the enumerators are so important. And that's why every year after these original requests come in, they go to the places that haven't responded and try to find things. And that has been a very, very difficult situation. I really wonder how reliable the numbers are going to be when we think about this. And this is a matter of particular importance to us here in Virginia because we, unlike most states, have our legislative elections in odd-numbered years. So when we get the numbers for 2021, we're going to be drawing lines for primaries in 2021 and for new legislative House of Delegates, Senate of Virginia districts in 2021. And so we are going to need those numbers faster than most states. And we are generally get treated better than most states because of our electoral calendar. They know we need it earlier at the census. But how good will these numbers be? If the enumerators can't get into the field, I think we're looking at a significant problem. And it isn't just who gets a congressional seat or not, it's also the kind of level of aid that a state might get. The level of resources in all kinds of government programs are dependent on the population of those states. So there are many, many impacts to consider. The reality, though, is that the people who are in office next year will be the ones who will have to work through these challenges.
All right. Well, with that, I think we're at the end of our Q&A. Thank you both so much. This was really terrific. We really, really appreciate this. Just as a quick preview here for next week, Monday's talk is going to deal with COVID's effects on climate change. It should be an exciting lecture, and we have several visitors outside of the university joining us for that. And Wednesday, we're gonna take a little bit of a turn, and we're gonna have a presentation by 3 of our art history faculty here about various aspects of how COVID has affected other areas of our lives, which is a little different from what we've been talking about. I'm really looking forward to that one. But I also want to take a moment to announce we have a special lecture happening next week that we really just confirmed, actually really just an hour ago. So an extra special guest coming in on Tuesday afternoon, and there'll be details on Sunday distributed in the email. The title tentatively is Social Justice Protest and in the Time of COVID. So it's an exciting opportunity here. I hope you all join us on Tuesday as well. Again, we'll distribute details on that in the Sunday email. Once again, thank you to Dr. Farnsworth and Dr. Cooperman for a really excellent talk today, and we'll see you all next time. Thanks so much. Bye-bye.